just a small town girl living in a lonely world.
In the bright lights of America's Got Talent, some victories hide deeper costs than anyone imagined. For Richard Goodall, the challenges have become too heavy to ignore. What he discovers next will shake the foundations of everything AGT fans thought they knew. The weight of the golden buzzer. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Richard Goodall was pushing his janitor's cart down the hallways of West Vigo Middle School, the squeak of the wheels echoing off lockers he'd cleaned for 23 years. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He almost didn't answer. He'd been getting strange calls ever since the audition aired. People wanting interviews, agents making promises, fans who'd somehow found his number. But something in his gut told him to pick it up. The voice on the other end was professional, clipped, urgent. "Mr. Goodall, this is Sandra Chen from AGT Production. We need to talk about some developments. Can you come to Los Angeles?" His stomach dropped. The tone wasn't congratulatory. By evening, Richard sat in his small apartment in Terre Haute, staring at the framed photo of himself on stage, Heidi Klum's hand frozen mid-air with the golden rain. That moment felt like magic. The culmination of a lifetime of singing in school hallways and at local bars finally earned his opportunity on the biggest stage in America. He'd won America's Got Talent Season 19, competing against thousands, stood on that stage as the golden buzzer exploded and the crowd roared his name. Richard Goodall, the humble janitor with the powerhouse voice, had become America's underdog champion. But something had been wrong from the very beginning. The production team had been acting strangely during the final weeks of competition. There were unexpected contract amendments, hurried signatures, legal documents that Richard's lawyer had advised him to sign without fully explaining it. He'd trusted the process. Trusted that winning AGT meant security, opportunity, and the chance to finally give something back to his wife Angie, who had supported him throughout his journey. But life doesn't always go as expected. The phone call from Sandra confirmed what he'd been afraid to acknowledge for weeks. Someone within the production had broken their silence. What they told him about the real cost of winning America's Got Talent would change everything Richard thought he understood about the show. Richard turned away from the photo, his jaw set with determination. He'd spent his whole life being overlooked, underestimated, treated as invisible. While students chased their dreams, he was left in the background as a janitor. But this threat was different. This one wore the face of the industry that had celebrated him, hidden behind contracts, negotiations, and carefully crafted television narratives. The sun was setting over Indiana, painting his modest apartment in shades of amber and gold. It would have been beautiful if Richard's mind wasn't racing with implications, with the dawning realization that his American dream might have problems attached, which he'd never agreed to solve. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever was happening behind the scenes of America's Got Talent, whatever reality had been building in the shadows of his triumph, it was time to bring it into the light. Even if it cost him everything. Echoes in the hallway. Richard had been working in West Vigo Middle School since 2001, a steady presence in the hallways, someone students barely noticed beyond a friendly wave. He'd sing sometimes while he worked, classic rock music echoing off the tile floors. Journey, Bon Jovi, Survivor, songs that made him feel alive when the repetitive work wasn't exciting. Angela, his girlfriend at the time, had been the one to push him. "You have a gift, Richard. The world should hear you." He'd laughed it off. A janitor from Terre Haute didn't belong on national television, but Angie had never stopped believing and never stopped encouraging him to chase the dream. When he finally auditioned for AGT in 2024, he'd almost backed out 3 times. Standing in that holding room with dancers, magicians, and young singers who looked like they'd been training their whole lives, Richard felt profoundly out of place. He was 55 years old. He wore his custodian uniform because it was the only thing that felt authentic. He had no gimmick, no backstory beyond janitor who likes to sing. But then he walked onto the stage. The moment he opened his mouth singing Journey's Don't Stop Believin', something shifted. The judges' faces changed, the audience fell silent, and Heidi Klum, tears streaming down her face, had slammed the golden buzzer, sending Richard straight to the live shows. It had felt unreal at first. Like all those years of invisible work, all those moments singing to empty hallways, had been leading to this singular moment of recognition. The golden buzzer had changed everything. Overnight, Richard went from anonymous janitor to viral sensation. His audition video racked up millions of views. People shared his story on social media, celebrating the everyday American who'd finally gotten his shot. Students at West Vigo made signs supporting Mr. Richard. The town of Terre Haute rallied behind their hometown hero. AGT became his full-time job. Rehearsals in Los Angeles, media training, costume fittings, social media obligations. The production team assigned him a handler named Marcus, a young guy who seemed genuinely invested in Richard's success. They'd bonded over late-night talks between rehearsals, Marcus sharing insights about the industry while Richard talked about life in Indiana. Marcus had seemed like one of the good ones, someone who cared about Richard as a person, not just content for the cameras. But there had been warning signs Richard had missed. The contract revisions that came through right before the live shows. The rights that granted AGT and NBC extensive control over how Richard could present himself, what songs he could perform outside the show, what partnerships he could pursue. His lawyer had flagged concerns, but the production team had assured him these were standard industry protections. Still, there were creative differences. Richard wanted to sing classic rock, the songs that had sustained him through decades of work. But the producers pushed him toward more contemporary choices, toward performances that created television moments rather than authentic artistic expression. He felt isolated. As the competition progressed, Richard noticed how other contestants were kept separate, how genuine friendships were discouraged in favor of manufactured rivalries. The producers wanted storylines, drama, and emotional arcs that fit their narrative structure. And then there were the promises, vague assurances about what winning the show looked like. $1 million prize, headline shows in Las Vegas, a recording contract, the chance to finally make music his career instead of his hobby. Richard had believed it all. Why wouldn't he? This was America's Got Talent, the show that discovered stars, that celebrated everyday people achieving extraordinary things. He'd seen past winners go on to successful careers. He'd watched underdogs become household names. He'd trusted the dream. Now, sitting in his apartment with Sandra Chen's cryptic phone call echoing in his mind, Richard realized his trust might have been misplaced. The machinery of reality television was more complex than he'd imagined, with gears that could crush the very people it celebrated. His phone buzzed again. A text from Marcus, the assistant who'd become a friend. "I know," Sandra called. "I'm sorry, Richard. We need to talk before you fly out. There are things you should know." Richard's hands trembled as he typed back, "What things?" The response took several minutes, long enough that Richard stood up, paced his small living room, looked out at the Indiana night, and wondered how a golden buzzer could lead to this kind of anxiety. When Marcus finally responded, it was just 3 words: "Everything's a lie." Fractured foundations. The flight to Los Angeles felt like traveling to an execution. Richard had made this trip dozens of times during the competition, each journey filled with excitement and nervous energy. This time, dread settled in his chest like concrete. Marcus had explained some of it over the phone, his voice thick with guilt and urgency, but the full picture remained unclear. "The $1 million prize isn't what you think," Marcus had said. "And the Vegas residency. Richard, there is no Vegas residency, not in the way they implied." The revelation had stunned him. The $1 million was paid out over 40 years, roughly $25,000 per year before taxes. After the mandatory fees, management cuts, and tax withholding, Richard would see maybe $12,000 annually for 40 years, less than he'd made as a janitor. And the Vegas headlining show? It was a single performance opportunity, with AGT retaining approval over song selection, staging, and marketing. Richard would essentially be performing as an AGT property, not as an independent artist. But that wasn't even the worst of it. Marcus explained that the contract Richard had signed gave AGT and its parent companies extensive rights over his image, his performances, and his story. They could use his likeness in promotional materials indefinitely. "It's standard for the industry," Marcus had said, though his tone suggested he knew how inadequate that justification sounded. "But it's also predatory. They take people at their most vulnerable and lock them into agreements that favor the network above all else." Richard had listened in growing horror. The dream he'd been living changed into something darker. "Why are you telling me this now?" he'd asked. "Why didn't you warn me before?" The silence on the other end of the line had stretched painfully long before Marcus finally answered. "Because they threatened my job. Because I have student loans and rent, and I convinced myself that you'd be fine, that you'd somehow be the exception. But then I saw what they're planning for the reunion special, and I couldn't stay quiet anymore." "What are they planning?" "They want to do a segment on what AGT winners are really doing now. They're going to show you back at the middle school, mopping floors, about how even winning isn't enough to escape your circumstances. They're going to turn your story into a cautionary tale while profiting from your pain." Richard had felt rage surge through him, hot and fierce. They'd celebrated him as an inspiration, then planned to humiliate him for ratings. Now, walking toward the meeting with Sandra Chen and the legal team, Richard felt that anger hardening into something more dangerous: determination. The meeting was held not at the AGT studios, but in an office building in Burbank. Richard was led to a conference room that felt designed to intimidate. Glass walls, expensive furniture, legal documents stacked on the table like a fortress. Sandra Chen was there, along with two lawyers Richard had never met, and a network executive whose smile felt genuine. "Mr. Goodall, thank you for coming," Sandra began, her tone suggesting this was anything but voluntary. "We wanted to discuss some concerns that have arisen regarding your post-show activities." Richard sat down slowly, keeping his expression neutral despite the anxiety. "What concerns?" One of the lawyers passed a document across the table. "We've noticed you've been performing at local venues in Indiana, using songs from your AGT performances. Discussing your AGT experience in these venues." "I sang at a charity event," Richard said carefully, "for a local children's hospital. I didn't charge anything." "Nevertheless," the executive interrupted smoothly, "your contract specifies that all performances within 12 months of your final AGT appearance must be approved by the network. You're in breach of that agreement." Richard felt his face flush. "I was raising money for sick kids." "We understand," Sandra said, though her tone suggested she didn't. "But the contract exists to protect the AGT brand and your own career trajectory. Uncontrolled performances dilute your value." The second lawyer leaned forward, her eyes cold and calculating. "We've also been monitoring your social media. You've made several posts that could be interpreted as violation of the production process." "I haven't said anything untrue," Richard replied, feeling the trap closing around him. "Truth is subjective," the executive said. "Perception is what matters. And right now, you're creating a perception that AGT somehow exploited you, which is a false behavior. We made you a star, Mr. Goodall. We gave you a platform you never would have accessed on your own." The words stung because they carried a grain of truth. Richard never would have reached millions of people without AGT. But the cost of that reach was becoming clearer with each passing moment. "What do you want from me?" Richard asked quietly. The lawyers exchanged glances, a communication similar to conversations with other vulnerable people. "We're prepared to offer an amendment to your contract," Sandra finally said. "Additional compensation for promotional appearances. More flexibility in your performance schedule. A percentage of merchandise revenue. In exchange for what? Your continued cooperation with the AGT narrative. No public criticism of the show or its processes. Active participation in our reunion special and any future AGT programming where your appearance is requested. And a formal NDA regarding this conversation and any concerns you may have about your contract terms." Richard stood up, his chair scraping against the polished floor. "I need to think about this." "You have 72 hours, the executive said, not bothering to hide the threat in his voice. "After that, we move forward with breach of contract proceedings. We'll sue for damages. We'll make it clear to the industry that you're difficult to work with, ungrateful for the opportunities provided. Your music career will be over before it starts." The flight back to Indiana was an endless suffering. Richard's mind cluttered with impossible choices. Fight the network and risk losing everything, or accept their terms and become complicit in a system that treats people like disposable content. Marcus met him at the Indianapolis airport, his face drawn with worry. "How bad was it?" "Worse than you warned me," Richard admitted as they walked to the parking garage. "They're not just trying to control my career. They want to own the narrative of my entire life." The drive back to Terre Haute felt like traveling between worlds. The closer they got to home, the more the promises of the show felt like elaborate lies. Out here, life was simpler. You worked hard, you treated people with respect, you kept your word. But in the entertainment industry, rules are different. Over the next 3 days, Richard convened quiet meetings with people he trusted. His wife Angie, who'd stood by him through decades of obscurity and was now watching their brief moment of recognition turn toxic. The reactions varied. Some urged him to take the deal, to accept the money and the restrictions because it was still more than he'd had before. Others were angry on his behalf, ready to fight despite not fully understanding what they'd be fighting against. "Maybe we should just accept it," Angie said during one particularly difficult conversation. "We've got bills, Richard. Your health isn't great. The money from AGT, even the restricted version, is more than we've ever had." "But it's not what they promised," Richard countered. "And if I sign that NDA, I can't even tell people the truth about what happened." Angie was quiet for a long moment, then took his hand. "My grandmother used to say that some things matter more than comfort. That dignity can't be bought back once you've sold it." Richard had lived 55 years in obscurity, content with small moments of joy, small connections with students, and a community he trusted. AGT had offered him fame, but at what cost? As the 72-hour deadline approached, Richard found himself back in the hallways of West Vigo Middle School. Classes had ended for the day, and the building was left in silence. He pushed his janitor's cart down the familiar path, let himself sing quietly, let the music fill the empty space. This was who he was, not a television character, but a man who found beauty in ordinary moments. Then something unexpected happened. The decision came not from Richard alone, but from an unexpected source. On the morning of the deadline, before he'd finalized his response to AGT, a lawyer named Catherine Morris appeared at his door. Not one of the network's attack dogs, but someone different. Older, with kind eyes, and a briefcase that looked like it had seen years of honest work. "Mr. Goodall, my name is Catherine Morris. I represent the Artists' Rights Advocacy Foundation. We've been following your situation with great interest." Over coffee at Richard's kitchen table, Catherine laid out an option nobody had considered. The foundation had been seeking a case to challenge how reality shows exploited contestants through contracts and false promises. They had resources, legal expertise, and most importantly, a willingness to fight without leaving the financial burden on Richard alone. "We can't guarantee victory," Catherine said honestly. "Media companies have deep pockets and powerful friends. But we can guarantee you won't face this alone. And we can make enough noise that other shows, other networks, will think twice before treating contestants as disposable content." It was a lifeline Richard hadn't dared to hope for. Within hours, he'd reached out to other AGT contestants from his season and previous years. What he found was a network of people who'd all felt the same exploitation but had been too isolated or too afraid to speak up. Performers who'd been promised careers and given restrictions. Winners who'd discovered the prize money was far less than advertised. Contestants who'd been edited into villains or victims regardless of their actual experiences. The decision was terrifying but clear. That afternoon, Catherine held a press conference in Indianapolis. Richard stood beside her, surrounded by a half-dozen other AGT contestants, as Catherine read a prepared statement detailing the allegations against the show and its production companies. The response was immediate and explosive. Within hours, the story was trending on social media under number Justice for Richard. News outlets picked it up, framing it as the everyday janitor versus the television machine. Other reality show contestants began coming forward with similar stories, creating a wave of revelations that threatened to engulf the entire industry. AGT's public relations team scrambled, releasing statements about their commitment to contestant welfare and fair treatment. Behind the scenes, according to Marcus, who still had friends in the production office, there was panic. Sponsors were asking questions. NBC executives were demanding explanations. The carefully constructed image of AGT as a wholesome talent showcase was crumbling. But Richard knew the real confrontation was yet to come, the reunion that cost everything. 3 days after the press conference, Sandra Chen called again. Her tone had changed, revealing something closer to desperation. "Richard, we need to meet, face to face. Not in LA, somewhere neutral." They agreed on Chicago, a midway point between Hollywood and Indiana. Richard brought Catherine and Angie. The network brought lawyers and executives he'd never met. Richard sat across from people who'd built empires on the dreams of performers like him. And for the first time since this began, he didn't feel small. The lead executive, a man named David Krasner, spoke first. "Mr. Goodall, this situation has gotten out of hand. We're prepared to make significant concessions to resolve it." "We don't want concessions," Catherine replied before Richard could speak. "We want transparency and reform." "We're prepared to restructure your prize payment," Krasner continued. "Full $1 million paid over 10 years instead of 40. Complete creative freedom for performances outside AGT-sponsored events. A formal apology for any miscommunication about contract terms." "And the NDA?" Richard asked. "Necessary," Krasner said. "We can't have every contestant who feels dissatisfied running to the press with exaggerated claims." "Exaggerated?" Richard felt anger surge through him. "You promised me $1 million and a Vegas career. You delivered a fraction of that and tried to stop me from singing at charity events. What's exaggerated?" One of the lawyers leaned forward. "Mr. Goodall, you need to understand the economics of television production. AGT costs millions to produce. The advertising revenue, the licensing deals, the sponsorships, all of that requires maintaining a certain image and brand integrity." After the concert, one student asked, "Are you going back to being a janitor?" Richard smiled. "I never stopped being a janitor. I just learned I could be other things too." That night, driving home with Angie beside him, Richard felt a peace he hadn't experienced since before the golden buzzer fell. The journey had been harder than he'd imagined, more painful than he'd expected, but it had also been necessary. Have you been following this story? What do you think about the ethics of reality television competitions? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and click the next video on your screen for another interesting story.